Hello, it's Monday. Here we are again, another Monday, another week. Things are with you, but in our house, Mondays are probably the least productive homeschool day. Get stuff done, but somehow it feels like a bit of an uphill struggle. And I guess it's like it always is, when you have to go to school on Monday or when you have to go to work on Monday, and it all feels a bit like hard work. And I suppose it's about the same as that. But it does feel a bit like it. It really does. So, anyway, never mind. We've done what we could. And even if it's less than we might have hoped, it's something. Today's Monday irritation is that we still don't have all the boxes of our new trampoline. So the first two were delivered a week ago today, and the third one was delivered the following day, so last Tuesday. And we still don't have the others, and what's more, I got a notice today saying the delivery was delayed today. Starting to get a bit annoyed, actually, about it, and my boys are really frustrated because they've been desperate for it to arrive. They've missed it terribly. Where are we? We're on chapter 11. Right. Yes, so that didn't go so well for Joe, did it? He'd ended up getting back into Lucy's world really quite soon after he'd last left. And found Tobias going out in the middle of the night, and so even though he'd only just got there, he followed him and to Lucy too, and he got off into a confrontation with Tobias because he realised that Tobias was actually planning what we would think of these days as an all-out terrorist attack on London. Kill the king, blow up the government and the Tower of London, which is where the gunpowder was kept, which would have blown that whole side of London to pieces if he'd managed to do that. And Lucy has managed to escape to try to find Tobias's plans, and then Joe's been hauled back into his own time, and of course he's collapsed on the ground, and he's ended up in A&E at the hospital in London, where he hasn't managed to be seen in a couple of hours because the poor people who work there are so busy, and in the end he checks himself out and he and Mum go off to find something to eat, but that is the end of their day in London, which is a bit of a shame because basically they missed their whole afternoon just waiting around. Never mind. So, okay, chapter 11. The last few days of the school year went by in a blur for Joe. It was the end of his time at Colborough Junior, and on the last day his classmates wore white t-shirts which they asked each other to write on. "Didn't you want to join in?" asked his friend Matthew when he arrived wearing a green top. "I forgot," Joe said. It was true, but he also felt too old for all this. He really didn't see the point either. It was hardly a big goodbye. Most of his class were going on to the same secondary school, and the younger children would be coming up behind them. The only people they were leaving behind for good were the teachers, and Joe wasn't sure he would ever want to wear a t-shirt with all their signatures. Even worse, some of the girls in his class were going round with books for people to write messages in. Two girls Joe didn't really like came and asked him to write something. He cringed. They seemed so young and so silly compared to Lucy. And what did they expect him to put? He hadn't said anything more significant to either of them over the last 4 years than, "Could you move up a bit?" or "Pass me that pen, please." Above all, he resented the interruption to thinking about Lucy. So on the first day of the summer holidays he sat down with his library books to do some proper thinking about her. "You're nuts," said Sam when he saw what Joe was reading. Joe ignored him. His brother couldn't possibly understand. As far as Joe was concerned, it was time well spent. Even if he couldn't trigger the time slip, it was still good to be prepared, just in case. There wasn't much in the books, however, that he hadn't already found out at the monument, or seen for himself with Lucy. He did discover that pudding was an old word for guts and bowels, so Pudding Lane had been named after the bits of animal intestines that fell off the butcher's carts going down to the dung boats on the river. It wasn't quite the row of bakeries and cake shops Joe had imagined. The other new fact, which gave him comfort, was that only 6 people had died in the fire. He remembered something about that from the monument, but putting an actual number on it, and such a low one, reassured him that Lucy was almost certainly safe, assuming she avoided trouble with Tobias. It also meant that if he managed to get back there to see the fire, he shouldn't be in danger himself. When he wasn't wishing he could make the time slip happen, Joe was worrying about when it would be. It was infuriating that it was so unpredictable. There were moments in his own time which would have been perfect, when he strained his ears to hear the telltale hissing, and there were awkward moments when he was glad to stay put. When it did finally happen, it was definitely one of the awkward times, and although he'd been waiting for it for over 3 weeks, it still took him completely by surprise. He was at the swimming pool with his brother, and had just dived into the water. Everything was muffled, so he didn't notice a hissing sound. There wasn't the dizziness either, presumably because he wasn't upright. The main reason he was surprised, though, was that he hadn't been thinking about Lucy, or at least not about the Lucy he'd met most recently. He'd been remembering swimming with Petrus at Fishbourne, and trying to recall whether Lucy had been able to swim in that world. As he plunged through the water, thinking about this, he found himself suddenly dry, dressed, and standing on firm ground. The dizziness caught up with him then. He stretched out his hands to either side. His fingers brushed against rough plaster. He blinked a couple of times and took a deep breath. The stink made him gag. He shut his mouth quickly. This must be the alleyway behind the Pewters' Hall, he thought. He checked over his shoulder just in case Tobias was still there, but there was no one to be seen. As he picked his way back to the street, he wondered what time it was. It must be day, because he could make out some of what was on the ground beneath his feet. Fish heads and chicken carcasses, heaps of muck, that had to be poo of some kind, a puddle of greasy grey liquid, and a pile of mouldy vegetables rotted away into slush. Yet even though he could see all this, it was not a bright day. The thread of sky visible between the buildings overhead was dark grey, as though a storm was about to break. Then he noticed the noises coming from beyond the alleyway. Louder than anything else was the snapping of fire. In fact, that was louder than he'd ever heard it before. There was a lot of shouting and wailing too, over the rumble of cartwheels and the clash of hooves. From some way ahead of Joe came a crash of something large falling, like a tree being felled. At the end of the alley he emerged into a street which was thick with smoke. It tasted acrid on his tongue and dry, as though it was sucking the moisture out of him. A cart rocked towards him, its load towering above the carter's head. The horse's ears were flat back, and Joe could see the whites of its eyes. Poor creature, he thought. It was terrified. All around, people were running to and fro. Many of them were clutching armfuls of belongings which they dumped on the ground. Outside the house nearest the alleyway, a trembling boy helped a man stack crates and boxes higher and higher. Joe couldn't see any flames from where he stood, but from the rattling carried on the wind, the fire couldn't be more than a street or two away. It seemed to be in the other direction from Lucy's house as far as he could tell. He ought to set off back along Fenchurch Street right now and go straight to her house. But somehow the pull of the fire was irresistible. Like a moth drawn to a flame, he turned left down a side street towards it. This street was even more crowded and noisy than the last. People barged past each other, cursing, many of them staggering under the weight of their haphazard loads. A woman dragged 2 large baskets along, stopping every few paces to shove the bed covers and wall hangings back in where they had tumbled out. Another rushed around in circles, shrieking. Her arms were draped with tapestry curtains, which she was vainly trying to keep out of the gutter. A young woman with a hugely pregnant stomach stood beside a cauldron filled with pottery, dishes and cups. As the cart approached, she ran forward and pleaded with the carter to take her and her cauldron, but the wheels just ground remorselessly onwards. Joe came to a crossroads. Out of the shelter of the buildings, the wind was strong, driving the heat of the fire ahead of it like a desert storm. Giant flakes of ash and sparks the size of leaves blew towards him. He flung up his hands to shield his face. His palm burned as a cinder brushed against it. His eyes were really watering now, and there was a bitter taste in his mouth. He knew he should turn back. Instead, he made his way on, down a road to the right, magnetized by the fire. People were stampeding past him now. Among the crowd, Joe noticed 3 boys pushing overloaded handcarts, urged on by a gentleman who was shouting at everyone to get out of the way. Several rough youths appeared from a side street, rolling barrels in front of them. They looked about them shiftily, as though they expected to be stopped. At one house Joe passed, the front door opened and a grubby man sidled out. Beneath his arm were 2 large packages, and Joe saw him pat the bulging pockets of his coat as he hurried away. Suddenly the sky burst orange. The snapping noise surged to a roar. Yet Joe still couldn't see the flames themselves. A box flew out of an upstairs window ahead of him, followed by 2 pictures and a rolled-up rug. In the street beneath, a boy retrieved them and stuffed them onto a cart already piled high. "That'll be a guinea a mile out to Kensington," the carter said. "But that's 20 times the usual price," cried the man beside him. "Where will I find 4 guineas?" "I can get my boy to start unloading," threatened the carter, with a hard glint in his eye. "No, no," the man wrung his hands. "We'll pay." Joe was appalled. In a few minutes this man's house would be gone, but the carter was determined to profit from his misfortune. "At least you can pay," wailed a woman from across the street. "Some of us can only take what we can carry." Joe eyed the grubby baby in her arms and the gaggle of dirty-faced children hanging on her skirts. She wouldn't be able to take much more than them with her, he guessed. The crackling was louder than ever now. Joe peered through the smoke. There, beyond the heads of the crowd, were leaping flames. He caught his breath, stunned by the enormity of the fire that suddenly loomed over everything. Sparks were flung high into the air, the sky overhead glowed, and the wind whipped into strange shapes. Joe was transfixed. Never in his life had he seen such a huge fire. The biggest, a house fire he'd seen on the television, was nothing compared to this. It was coming closer, but it wasn't moving all that fast. At least the people who lived in the houses were able to escape, but there was something pitiless about the way it lapped from rooftop to rooftop, as unstoppable as the tide. "My bed!" screamed a woman. "Why didn't we move everything into the church like I said? You said your aunt's house would be safe. You said the fire would be put out before it got this far." The woman jabbed her finger at her husband with every accusation. "What was the point in moving it at all?" she shrieked. "Any minute now, everything will be lost." There was a flapping sound as curtains billowed out of the next-door window. Tongues of flame licked all round them. The woman fell silent and then began to cry. With a shock, Joe realised how close the fire was now. It was getting dangerous. After all, this wasn't bonfire night, with ropes to keep you safe and wardens on watch. This was more like a bushfire. It was time to go. He turned hurriedly and began to make his way back along the street in the same direction as the rest of the crowd. Even though he was going with the flow, it was difficult to move quickly. Heap after heap of belongings lay on the ground, and the road was blocked by carts every few houses. Joe squeezed past a frail old man being carried out in his bed and turned left up another street, hoping he was going the right way. It wasn't until he reached Threadneedle Street that it dawned on him that he hadn't seen anyone trying to put the fire out. If that had been happening at home, there would have been fire engines with hoses, battering the flames with water. Here he hadn't seen so much as a bucket, even though there must have been taps in some of those houses. As he came to Lucy's house, his footsteps faltered. What was he going to say to her family this time? Her parents must surely think him rude and ungrateful to have left without telling them, especially so soon after they'd welcomed him back. He stood on the doorstep, trying to summon up courage. He had to trust he would know what to say. It had always worked before. He hadn't even touched the knocker, however, when the door opened. "You've come," Lucy exclaimed. "I hoped you would." She seized his hands. "I'm afraid I got the time wrong," she whispered. "When you told me about the fire, there was so much else happening. I must have misremembered it. I was going to go. I was going to try and stop it, but it was too late." Joe squeezed her hands. "Never mind. You're safe. That's the main thing. I've been so worried about you because of Tobias." Before Lucy could answer, Joe heard Ellen's voice. "Is someone there, Lucy? Who is it?" Joe's heart sank. Of course she wasn't alone in the house. Why else would she have been whispering? "It's Joseph Hopkins, madam," Lucy called back to her mother. "Word must have reached him that Tobias has gone." "What? When?" Joe was incredulous. "What did you tell her this time?" "I said I'd heard Tobias drag you out of the house," she muttered. "You did say to blame him, after all." Her eyes twinkled. "I'll explain later." She led the way through to the sitting room. Joe had expected to find Ellen working at her embroidery frame, but she was packing the contents of the sideboard into a large wooden crate. "Here you are again, Master Hopkins," she said, with a tired smile. "You are very welcome, though we're not such merry company as when you were last here. London faces another great trial, as I'm sure you've seen. Where the plague destroyed its people, it looks as though this fire may swallow the city itself." She sank down into a chair and rubbed her face with her hands. "It's been burning for the best part of 2 days already, and grows more ferocious by the hour. But tell me, where have you been these last 3 weeks? What happened to you?" So that's the end of the chapter. What does Joe say next? What would you say next? This is something that's always a challenge for me as the writer, trying to work out what he can say now. What's the excuse this time? Because this keeps happening, doesn't it? He keeps being pulled back into his own world. He keeps then having to make excuses to explain where he'd been and why he wasn't there. And every time he and I have to think of something new. So yeah, think about what you might say if you were him, and then come back again tomorrow and find out. So tomorrow we'll have chapter 12, and on Wednesday we'll have chapter 13. I won't be reading on Thursday because it's my son's birthday, and so I have a feeling I might have other things I need to do rather than this. So we'll be on chapter 14 on Friday, and then we'll finish off next week. And that'll be 4 books in the series read. Goodness me, we are getting on with it, aren't we? I never thought it would go on this long. The lockdown, that is, and therefore the streamed readings. The series I knew would go on this long. I always planned 7 books, so this is not a surprise, especially since I've now written them, so I know how far I have to go. But I didn't really expect to get this far through reading them before we all were allowed out again. Anyway, I will see you tomorrow, 5 o'clock or thereabouts.